Hey guys, Kyle, the Death Knight of Anime here, bringing you my review for My Hero Academia, chapter 254. And before we get into the actual review, let's talk about the cover pages, or I guess this is part of the review, but yeah, the cover pages, because we basically get two cover pages, both of which are advertising the new movie coming out. And while both of these cover pages are cool looking, these cover pages are kind of one of the more problematic aspects of this chapter, because even though because okay, like the biggest, I'll start with like the 2 page cover spread, because that is like the bigger problematic one. Um, even like in that cover page, Horikoshi basically split the group up into two teams, from one on each side of the cover page, and overall, and no, and weirdly enough, even though the characters weren't doing anything, it overall felt a little. It still felt weirdly a little too busy and crammed together. But a lot of this, I think, is also just because the characters weren't really doing much other than posing. Whereas with other cover pages, like, don't get me wrong, the other cover pages are busy, but at least with the other cover pages, Horikoshi has his characters at least doing something, or doing some sort of act, or doing some sort of doing some sort of action in order to hide, I guess, how busy, in order to hide hide some kind of problem with the cover page. With this cover page, because the characters are just kind of standing around and posing, a lot of the, I guess you could, a lot of the chapter, in a weird way, does still feel like a little too. A lot of the cover page does feel a little too crammed together, I guess you could say, or something like that. Yeah, I don't know if I'm the only one who had that problem, but yeah, that is kind of something I noticed. Um, and okay, so first things first, following up from what I said last week, this chapter was interesting because, in many respects, it gives you enough background in history to understand the connection and why Aizawa was having such a hard time come to grips with these circumstances. But the key thing with this chapter is in the simpler things, like dialogue in interactions. Because, okay, a lot of what this chapter does, it basically, it'll invest you enough for pretty much those who haven't read the Vigilantes manga. A lot of what this chapter entails, it's going to invest you enough in order to get in order to it'll invest you enough in the sense of it gives you enough to latch onto in order to understand, the connection of basically why this is such a big deal to Aizawa, and of why Aizawa is having such a hard time coming to grips with these circumstances and whatnot. But and why this is so, as well as understanding like the connection between like Oboro and Aizawa, and their history. It gives you enough in order to understand the base level of that, but um, but at the same time, it is one of those things where, because of the dialogue and the interactions and whatnot, it works better and is generally more impactful if you have full context of the history from the Vigilantes manga. Like, again, as is on a bare bones level, what we get in this chapter, it gives you just enough in order to latch onto, and kind of and understand where Aizawa is coming from. But again, it is kind of one of those things where or reading the Vigilantes manga, it does kind of help, like reinforce a lot of this, I guess you could say, or something like that. But yeah, so again, I feel I feel I'm kind of forcing it on people here, but and and obviously I kind of want to wait and see where next week's chapter leads us. But in many respects, if next week's chapter doesn't give us like a full, like, in some respects, that's almost one of those things where whatever happens next week, I almost still want to recommend everyone like read the Vigilantes manga in order to understand like the history between Oboro and Oboro and Aizawa, because it is kind of key to what's happening now here. Um, Now, supposedly, now this is something I never thought I'd talk about, but supposedly one complaint that's popped up from last week, and I guess carried over this week a little bit, is that Aizawa's backstory is too much like Kakashi's. And I somewhat have to disagree with that, because not only at this not only do I consider this kind of backstory to be a little, well, to be a bit more of a to be a bit more mainstream at this point, at least as a storytelling trope. But in many respects, I'd argue the overarching lesson of each of the two backstories is different, even if ever so slightly. In Naruto, what Kakashi learned from Obito's death was the importance of teamwork and not letting your comrades die. Whereas with Aizawa, Oboro's death was more along the lines of a lesson about the difference between acting out of one's own self-interest versus acting for the sake of others. And by association, it's not only by association. One of the big things to take away from that as well is not only what the difference is, and not only what the core difference between these two actually is, but it also kind of reinforces how how to pretty much use. It also kind of reinforces a little thing of basically how to properly use your quirk versus abusing your quirk versus abusing your quirk almost. So yeah, I feel even though on the surface there might be there might be similarities. It is when you look a little deeper beneath, beneath the surface of it. I think you will find the difference, and maybe you'll even find a different interpretation from what I've seen. But yeah, I feel that is the biggest difference here, is that Aizawa learned that there is a difference between acting for your own self-interest and acting for the sake of others. That's the biggest thing. Um, on a slightly lighter note, I guess you could say, well, I couldn't. I couldn't the one thing I do gotta admit is that there was a lot of pretty much dry humor and a bit of comedy, and for a series of as this chapter was, that there was a little bit of dry humor and a little bit of dry humor and comedy throughout that, just in a line said here and there. And one line that Aizawa said that I couldn't help burst out laughing at was his jab at the shonen power friendship trope in this chapter, because it was not only it's not only one of the better, very subtle fourth wall breaks that My Hero Academia has done, but it felt like such a burn at any series that has used this as a means to solve every problem that has ever existed within these kind of stories. It's obviously with shonen, friendship is always the power of friendship is always going to play a part in one way or another. But with this, it almost felt like Horikoshi was basically was jabbing at everyone that has pretty much abused this trope, which, to be fair, I think he's kind of guilty of himself with this too. But it's it felt like he was basically jabbing everyone that has used and abused this particular trope within the context and how it's used within these kind of stories. Beyond that, though, we basically get a better understanding of basically why Aizawa is here. It's not just to kind of reason with Oboro, but as pretty much Gran Torino said, they're basically using what Aizawa and basically Mike are doing here as a little bit of an experiment, because if this goes in the way they plan, then Aizawa's quirk could be a helpful key in order to help awakening the Nomu and turning them back to normal again. We get a little bit of a setup with that, with the possibility of not just defeating the Nomu anymore, but actually helping them like return back to the people they were, I guess. So yeah, nice little bit of setup there. And yeah, just based off the way Kurogiri talks and Aizawa's reactions in this chapter, you can tell there's definitely is a small piece of Oboro still in there. But the thing is, considering how much Horikoshi likes to subvert the trope, so to speak, I imagine the plan here isn't exactly going to the way we think. Even if Aizawa managed to break through any further, than he already has, there's probably going to be some kind of hitch to it in some way or another. But yeah, guys, that's my review. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Crunchyroll. Death Knight of Anime, signing off. Later, guys.